And so that kind of gave me the way to write about the place. You write about a place that's disappearing, and ultimately you find all these attractive things to write about it or to think about it, but you can't keep it. You can't keep change from happening. Loss and change are things that confront us all. And so McCarthy, the ghost town, as a monument to impermanence, as I called it, there's that seeming contradiction.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, back for his second appearance on the podcast, is author Tom Kizzia. He is most well known for his best-selling 2013 book, Pilgrim's Wilderness, a true story of faith and madness on the Alaska frontier, which was chosen by the New York Times as the best true crime book set in Alaska. Kizzia began his life in our state in the late 70s as a Homer-based journalist at the Homer News. In the early 80s, he was hired by the late Howard Weaver to work at the Anchorage Daily News, where he started as a crime reporter. In 1983, he visited McCarthy for the first time to investigate a mass shooting in that ghost town that had killed 6 people. Kizzia and his wife later built a cabin near McCarthy. It was this connection to the community that enabled him to get close to Papa Pilgrim, the patriarch of his most famous book. Cold Mountain Path, Kizzia's third book, preserves the rollicking history of McCarthy from the abandonment of the Kennecot mine in 1938 until the Mail Day murders in 1983. For Cold Mountain Path, Kizzia was named 2022 Historian of the Year by the Alaska Historical Society. Tom Kizzia, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. You said you'd get me on before the end of the year.
It was a close one. I saw you speak at the Anchorage Unitarian Universalist Fellowship about your former editor at the ADN, Howard Weaver, who'd passed away. I thought we'd just start there. You wrote an obituary that appeared in the paper. It's so interesting, so well written. Had you written it in anticipation, or did you write it right when you found out?
A little bit of anticipation. I actually sat up in bed a couple of weeks before thinking, oh shit, I gotta do that, write that for Howard, because I had written the one for Don Young ahead of time. And I just had finished one for Jimmy Carter, which is still on the shelf, looking at his Alaska experiences. And then I'd been following Howard's illness, and it just suddenly occurred to me that was something that was on me. And it took me a couple of weeks to get up the courage to write him and say, hey, you probably understand I need to do this. And Barb, his wife, responded and said, he's not speaking anymore. It's a matter of days. And so I went into a panic mode and started writing around the clock, and he died within 2 days. So I did have 2 days of running time to get ready, but that was all. Fortunately, when you're writing about a writer, there's a lot ready to be quoted.
And you had, I guess, a 40-year relationship with him or more.
Yeah. I could write with confidence about who I thought he was. Yeah.
So your first interaction with him, the Anchorage Daily News was potentially going under at the end of the 70s. And a couple of folks had started the Alaska Advocate, the weekly publication. And you were writing from Homer for that publication. Was that how you met Howard?
That was how I met. I just wrote a few things for the paper. I was doing other things in Homer, but I had come to Alaska with that in mind, that what the state really needed was a good alternative weekly with the new journalism that was filling the sales of journalism in those days in the 70s. And it was great when they started it and were interested in the things I wanted to write about. But then to go up and meet him was really exciting because I was still just out of college and had been working in weekly newspaper. And here was the star of Anchorage journalism. And he was not much older than I was, but he was just great as an example of what I could be doing in life. And so I got to know him that way. And then when he took over the Anchorage Daily News for McClatchy, he invited me to come join his team.
And as I recall from our previous conversation, you were offered to cover oil and gas, which was considered the dream job, that what every reporter in Alaska at that time would want. And you took the less coveted police beat.
Howard had done that too. He had started out, and he writes in his memoir, Write Hard, Die Free, about starting out as a police reporter for the Anchorage Daily News out of college. And at the Times, the rival Anchorage Times excluded coverage of drugs and prostitution. And this is during the pipeline boom. And they wanted to present a proper pro-business picture of what was going on in Anchorage. And so he was delighted. That left him so much room to cover the demi-monde of Anchorage. And I had the same impulse when I got there. I wanted to cover the dramatic stories of the streets.
And what year did you start at the Anchorage Daily News?
82.
And so to get us to we're going to talk about two of your books today, Cold Mountain Path and Pilgrim's Wilderness. But to get to Cold Mountain Path, 1983, tell us about getting the phone call to fly to McCarthy, or how that all unfolded.
I was working in the newsroom at the time, so it wasn't a phone call. It was somebody visiting my desk. But I think the trooper report came out not in the evening about what had happened that day in McCarthy. And so the paper wanted to send me as the police reporter straight out there the next morning. And so flew out at dawn, straight out.
What did the trooper report say exactly? What was the initial report?
It said 6 dead in McCarthy, which was a ghost town that I'd heard of, but didn't really know much about. And it was inaccessible in the winter except by airplane. And Howard said, we got to go and do a story, go there to do the story, not just quote over the phone. And I got out there, and there was hardly anyone to talk to because everybody had been killed pretty much. I mean, there were a few people around, and I was able to eventually find some of them before I had to fly back and I would story that night.
Yeah, I would imagine that the folks who were there didn't want to talk to a reporter if they just lost their wife, or I don't know.
That wasn't an issue. But this was well before this became an epidemic in America, and 6 dead and 2 wounded. And what I wanted to know was, what is this community, and who are the people who were killed, and what did they mean to Alaska? Well, tell me about them. And there was some other coverage that tended to look at who was the bad guy and how did it all happen. And that was secondary for me initially. I really wanted to know about what community all about, living out here this remote in the Wrangell Mountains. And that became the subject of 2 books. I went out there as a police reporter, but I was also still the American Studies major that I probably talked to you about in that last conversation. And this was such a holdover frontier community from the 19th century. It seemed like I was just fascinated to find out more about it. And people wanted to talk about who they'd lost. And there were brief conversations at that time. But I went back then in August for a whole week to get to know the community much better, when there are a lot more people there in the summer, and really to do a portrait of the town and how it was recovering. And that kind of, frankly, that was the frontier resilience that I was able to write about. It was just inspiring to me. And I ended up establishing some long-term relationships in the community, and eventually having my own cabin out there and being part of the community itself.
I guess there was 2 trips then. So you had the day after the murders, and then you went in August of that year to do a follow-up story. And I was curious about how much of that was what you used in the chapter in Cold Mountain Path about the shooting, and how much was deep research that you did years later?
A lot of it was researched later, because what I didn't have in August was the psychiatrist's reports about the killer, who we still didn't know a whole lot about except what people out there knew and could talk about. And because he never went to trial, he pled out, and he's still alive in the state prison system.
Lou Hastings.
Yeah, Hastings, right. And so we never really had that kind of closing that a trial can provide to a larger community, or for that matter, to McCarthy. We were waiting for that when I was there in August, and that never happened. So this chapter, in a way, was a way to bring that to a close.
Maybe folks who lived in Alaska during the 80s knew all about the details of it. However, I did not. And when I read the chapter about the shooting, the scary part for me, when the guy who'd been shot in the face and then was put on a plane to fly out, and then when the troopers took Lou Hastings into custody, he said that his name was
Chris Richards. Yeah.
Chris Richards.
He pretended to be the guy who first got.
And I guess you wrote the chapter very well, because for a brief moment, I thought, wait, who was the guy in the plane? For some reason, I was like thrown off by it. And I was like I had the hair stand up on the back of my head. I was like, oh my God, who is who? Who killed who?
Yeah, the troopers were smarter than you and me.
Yes.
They knew that they had already interviewed Chris Richards.
Well, and the other thing is he had that one victim, I think, was it Sally, who had the turquoise coat on, and she had run and hid behind the greenhouse, and he had
Donna,
and he'd gone to look for her, and she'd hid behind the greenhouse. And so he said that his accomplice was a woman wearing a turquoise coat. And that's why, and I remember that when she approached the troopers, they did pull guns out.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, wow, he was a
smart guy, but not that smart in that he thought he could somehow blow up the pipeline in all of this. And it took me a while in writing the Cold Mountain Path book to figure out how to tie it thematically to the subject of this preservation of this ghost town and this atmosphere. But I realized it really did fit. He was the ultimate opponent of people living in the wilderness. And as the people out there were saying, these people who were killed are the most ardent environmentalists you're going to meet. They're really living their life. They're not here trying to destroy the wilderness. They're actually trying to be part of it. And that whole idea of being a community within a natural world that's still wild is the high mark of Alaska, what we're trying to do as a civilization here, or some of us are. And so it was just seemed distilled in that community. And to have him try to wipe them out because he thought people didn't have a place in nature at all was really more a sign of his depression and his psychosis than an environmental political program.
You did a great job in the book of saving it towards the end. And the reason why I liked that is I felt that one of the messages was that people didn't really want to talk about 1983, that they really didn't want that to be what they were known for. So I really appreciated that the bulk of the book is not about 1983.
It was also right at that time that the national park had been created. Legislation was passed in 1980. They had just figured out the idea of this community living in a frontier state was going by the boards, because we were now in a new state where the wilderness was patrolled wilderness. Under the Park Service, it was no longer just the open frontier that the 19th century imagination projected upon it. And so that was all happening just at the time of the murder. So that was the logical end of my book, which was describing the ghost town period between the departure of Kennecot and the arrival of the national park. And it just happened to end with that terrible tragedy.
Right. I'd like to talk about Kennecot. That is the beginning of the book. And the ruins of the mine are still the tourist attraction today. And you wrote in the book about $200 million worth of copper had been removed from the Chitna district up until it was the closure in 1938. And I don't know what $200 million is in 2023 money, but my guess is a lot more than $200 million. That
Calculated that somewhere, but yeah, it was immense considering the investment that they'd made.
right. And it was the property of the company. That money, the point that was made in this particular early chapter was that money didn't really go to McCarthy or to the state of Alaska. It went to the Kennecot company. And when they left the state, they took that wealth with them, really.
And that was the legacy of territorial days. There was no taxation, meaningful taxation on the mines. And at the Constitutional Convention, it was much discussed that we don't want to have other Kennecots come in and do that to Alaska, just take and not leave anything behind. As Ernest Greening said, they left a hole in the ground in 3 ghost towns and towns that needed relief, needed to go on welfare, although most of the people had left. And that was an image that they didn't want to project into the future for Alaska. And so they came up with tougher resource leasing policies and taxation that were the basis of Prudhoe Bay and Alaska's wealth of the past few decades. And so I think you can draw a pretty straight line from the Kennecott experience, painful as it was for the territory, to the years of prosperity.
Although they did leave more than a hole in the ground, though, because they left all of these furnished cabins and the sort of like mansions in the middle of nowhere that were just abandoned. And I thought that was a really interesting section about the treasure hunting mentality of the folks who remained behind in McCarthy and people who would go and take fancy china and have that in their home. And you told a funny story about the guy who had said that he was going to create a library in his house, and he was going to go up the next day and get the books. And
somebody else had rushed in.
Yes, the guy he was talking to rushed up, and you actually wrote about it. You said that the guy heard what I said, that I was going to go get some books. So he went and got all the books himself, and then he threw them down in the rain somewhere behind his house. just this crazy stuff that they were doing, like one-upping each other, and basically because it was all free stuff. It was just left there.
Yeah, that was part of the scavenger culture that was out there, was to live off the land. And the land included mullioned window frames and everything that they needed to build their cabins with, and bathtubs, and all coming out of Kennecott. And there was great rivalry among themselves. And then once the road finally opened in the 70s and tourists started coming in and taking things, they got really defensive. It created a community in a way that hadn't been there before. It was us against these outside takers. And they were actually stopping trucks and taking things out of people's trucks, saying, you can't take that.
Right. I do want to talk about the debate over building roads and bridges, because that is really a through line through the book, is whether they should update the road, but whether they should build the bridges. Like, that's just a constant refrain. But what I appreciated was that you had photos throughout the book, and we're still talking about Cold Mountain Path. And what was always surprising to me was when you had a young couple, a married couple. I'll find a picture, so I'm talking about something real. But every time you'd be describing them, and then I would get to the picture, I'd be like, oh my gosh, they look just like a normal couple. And they are living in the middle of nowhere in the 1950s. It was just such a bizarre decision for these people to do this. Like Jim and Maxine Edwards, their picture from 1966, this could be like down the street in Anchorage. Like, it's just, they're sitting out on the porch, the 2 kids, the mom and the dad, I don't know, and they're probably in their 30s. And of course, Jim Edwards was there for 60 years. Like, he never left.
Yeah. Yeah.
And his wife was killed on the Mail Day shooting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. They were unique out there in their domesticity and the way they were able to bend that whole valley to their domestic needs.
Yeah. So these folks who decided to make their life in McCarthy, there wasn't a way to drive there for a long time. And they appreciated being completely removed, like being in the bush. being separated.
Yeah, most did. There's always some who think this place would be great if we could just have better access. And it's that short-term mentality of thinking that this will be great for me for the next 5 years, but then you have to stop and think, how will the community change if access is easy? And that to this day, there's still efforts periodically. I think there's one underway now to widen the road and maybe pave it and straighten it and get tour buses in there, and it would become a completely different place. One of the old timers that I met in August 83 when I was there said, if you could drive to McCarthy, it wouldn't be here. That was important to me as a writer because, like you say, that was a through line, that mentality through the years, that discussion, that conversation. And you really need a local history is just a jumble of pieces, of a jigsaw pieces that don't have any kind of picture unless you find a way to tell a story, a particular story about the place. And that was really the story of this place, its isolation, the sanctuary that helped tie the individual anecdotes and characters together, going back to the 30s and the closing of the mines.
One thing I'll mention is that McCarthy is really a white settlement. And you did talk about the Atna people. This land was Atna land, but they'd never really had a settlement there. And I think, at least to the environmentalists, to the hippies who may have moved there was something attractive about not occupying native land and living in an area that didn't have that ancestral indigenous presence. You touched on it.
Yeah, it made it cleaner for them. And certainly in later times, that it was the Park Service or the Congress that kind of elbowed the Atna people out of the conversation when it came time to pass Anilka and create the national park. All of the land in the Wrangles was set aside for conservation purposes and not for selection under the Land Claims Act. But the Land Claims Act was the big settlement, but it wasn't the only settlement in terms of historical truth. And yeah, but the Atna people were, I described in a few pages, their early history out there, but they were out of the picture from the time Kennecot arrived, other than getting some employment along on the railroad that came up from the coast to haul the ore out.
And Chitna means Copper River?
Yeah. The Chitna River was the Copper River, I think.
So back to the debate over the road. On page 124, you had Curtis Green say that the physical isolation and absence of a highway constitutes a large part of the reason we choose to live in the Chitna Valley. He said tourists who manage to make their way this far deserve to be rewarded with a visit to a truly different place, not just another overcrowded, littered tourist attraction. So I think that's like encapsulating McCarthy being McCarthy because it's hard to get to.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary because it's so easy to say, this is a great place. Everybody should have a chance to go see it. That argument you hear all the time in the tourist industry, that if it's a great place, then you can't be exclusive and keep it just for yourself. You need to let other people come. And the more people, the better in that mentality. And there's obviously a lot of commercial incentives, people trying to make money on people or corporations trying to make money off of that idea. But as they push their way in there, eventually it doesn't become the thing that was there to see at the start.
I've been to McCarthy many times. I love McCarthy. I first visited in 1998. I've been going a long time. I took my mother there probably 5 years ago. She hated it. My mother is at an age where she doesn't want to be driven on a dirt road 60 miles. She doesn't want to have to walk across a pedestrian bridge and wait for a shuttle service. This was literally, she felt that I had sentenced her to some form of hell by taking her to McCarthy. It was not my mother's cup of tea.
Yeah, but if you make it pleasant for your mother, then it's not going to be what it has been for others. And that was true even when they put the footbridge in and replaced the tram. They used to have to when I was there in 83, you had to get into town by pulling yourself in a cable car across the river. And somebody describe that as the perfect self-administering interview system. And
So 1983, you went the first time as the reporter. You went back in August, and then you did have a cabin there. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with McCarthy?
yeah, it was soon after the murders and my coverage out there that I met my wife, Sally, and she had land out there and was ready to build a cabin. So after we got married, we went out and built a cabin there together. It was just a kind of a coincidence that we had McCarthy in common at that point. And then
How did she know McCarthy, or how did she have the land?
she had come to Alaska to work for the Sierra Club, come up from Washington, D.C., and had been drawn out there for a visit her first summer, I think, through some of her connections in the environmental community. And this was in the late 70s. And just really liked it and came pretty close to abandoning her professional career and living out there. And in the end, ended up with just a piece of land and to build on. And her life was in Anchorage and Democratic Party politics and things like that. But she had this rural hankering, as many of us do. And mine was toward Homer and hers was toward McCarthy. And so we built that cabin out there and would go out periodically, but it was never more than a recreational cabin for us.
Did you go in the winter?
A couple of times, yeah. But mostly it was a summer place, yeah.
And do you still have the cabin?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a great piece of my life. And it was because I had the cabin out there that in the early 2000s that I heard about this family that had showed up out there that was causing a lot of mayhem, and that was the Pilgrim family. And so that was how I was drawn into that.
Right.
Well, as a local guy.
That is perfect transition. So how did you first hear about the Pilgrim family?
I heard from friends who I knew out there that this was going on. And as a reporter, I was always looking for stories about people in situations that seemed to speak to the larger moment in history in Alaska. And certainly that transition from a open frontier to a sort of national park landscape is the time that we were going through in Alaska. And as a journalist writing the first rough draft of history, I was looking for those stories. And this seemed like one. This family was having a war with the National Park Service over access to their remote homestead. And they had just moved up there. And much after the park, it wasn't like the park was created around them. They showed up 20 years after the park was established, but they had bought an inholding of private property. And under the Alaska law, they felt that they had access rights, that the Park Service, frankly, had not really figured out what their policy was going to be on this. And he literally drove a bulldozer through that loophole and
built a road.
Yeah, built, or as he said, rebuilt an old road that had gone back to nature. And so
we're talking about a family of 15 with
15 children.
Yeah.
15 children and a 13-mile road through a national park. And Park Service, you can't get on a bulldozer and cut a road through a national park, even to get to an Alaska homestead. And so that was the initial battle, and people in McCarthy were taking sides. There were people on both sides.
Although I'll just say that from in the beginning, people tended to take the side of the family. Most people were sympathetic with the family arriving, wanting to support the family, is my impression from reading your book. Is that
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that. But they just put phones into McCarthy at the time. And so I was able to reach Papa Pilgrim on the phone and interview him. And he was delighted when he heard that I had a cabin out there, because he felt, oh, good, you're a local, then I can bring you into this group of locals who think I'm a great guy. And he was this pious Christian, soft-spoken, very...
And it wasn't just that you were a local that could get brought in, but he felt comfortable talking to you because he believed that God had sent a reporter who had a cabin in McCarthy. You know, I think he believed that there was some sort of divine reason that you were the reporter to tell his story, something like that.
I guess. When he suggested that, I went along with it. I wasn't going to argue against that, but I could tell just from his talk on the phone, I thought, this guy is a charlatan. This is incredible. But I didn't say that I didn't challenge him. I wormed an invitation out of it to go out there. And that was the big turning point when I actually rode horses out that road and out to visit that summer. And then there were some big stories that followed that.
Right. So tell us about going out there to visit, and what was did the ADN send you, or was this like, I'm going to do the story on my own? Or
Oh, yeah. No, I did the first story over the phone, and the conflicts were etched out there, but the actual family that was in the middle of this wasn't really, it was hard to describe them over a phone interview. So that's what I wanted to add to the story. And we rode out there. And at that point, he had the backing of the Alaska's Land Rights Coalition. They were really pushing him to stand up to the national park, and they were flying supplies into them. And it was getting to be a big political thing. And so I rode out there with a photographer and visited overnight. And it was within a couple of hours of being there that the whole fight with the Park Service melted away as a priority. And I thought, what is going on in this household? I'd never been in such a obviously pent up, quiet down.
To paint it out for listeners, the oldest children were in their late 20s, and then it went all the way down to small children. The mom, she had been with Papa Pilgrim since she was 16, and she was 46. So she basically had a child every other year for the past 30 years. And
I sat there, I interviewed him, and it went way into dinner time, and there was no dinner stirring, and there was not a peep from this family of 15. Like, Dad, I'm hungry. It was very repressed. And he was telling me all about their lifestyle and how holy and righteous it was. And when I tried to peel them away later to talk to them, there was always at least two of them standing there, as I realized, watching each other in a sort of classic cult way. And I went away freaked out about what was going on, but I didn't know what was happening. And
you didn't see any signs of physical abuse in the children or anything like that?
No, quite the opposite. They were all talking the line about how lucky they were to be able to live that way. That was very clearly their marching orders. And it seemed like marching orders, but you can't prove that as a reporter. But then Papa Pilgrim said, I never allowed a reporter out here before or talked to one, because after what that one reporter wrote about my father, I didn't trust journalists. And I wrote down in my notebook, look up his father and find out what happened. And when I got back to town and found out who his father was and started digging into his past, I had, holy smoke. And then I realized I was onto something big, and he did not like it when that story showed up in the paper.
Papa Pilgrim's real name was Bobby Hale, and his dad's name was I.B. Hale. So tell us about who his dad was and about Bobby Hale's early life.
Yeah, I can do it briefly. The journalist who had written about I.B. Hale was Seymour Hersh, the country's leading investigative reporter, and he'd done a book about John F. Kennedy and the dark side of the Kennedy years. And I.B. Hale was the head of the Dallas bureau for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and seemingly on his own, according to Hersh, he had been investigating, perhaps with the complicity of J. Edgar Hoover, Kennedy's relationship with a mob boss's girlfriend, Judith Exner. And there was reports, and I got them from Hersh, the FBI reports, observing Bobby Hale and his twin sneaking into Judith Exner's apartment in LA and planting bugs and on her phone. And it's
crazy.
Deeper and crazier. Eloping with the governor's
Right. Eloping with the governor's daughter. That's the really shocking part for me, is that Bobby Hale married John Connolly's 16-year-old daughter when he was 16 as well, I guess. They were both.
And ran away, and then she committed suicide, or was
quote unquote
killed.
Committed suicide, but shot with a rifle in the back of the head.
They dropped the inquest because they didn't want a scandal, but he cited that issue, that episode, for the rest of his life as what sent him off to be a hippie backcountry person, and then ultimately the ultimate Jesus freak, and then a patriarch of this big family where he created his own cult in the mountains of New Mexico, and then moved off to Alaska when
In the mountains of New Mexico, living on Jack Nicholson's property, the
yeah
actor. It's
yeah.
so crazy.
So anyway, they came to Alaska and tried to start over, and it was the last frontier for them. And to me, what made it such a great story was the fact that he was hiding behind all that frontier mythology in order to do the things that he wanted to do, and it was convenient place for him.
Right. I think from the really religious folks who were following the story, feeling like a kindred spirit in the Pilgrims.
Yeah, that's the way they presented, and they were musicians, and they did all those. They presented so well to the rural community for a long time. But over time, there was a lot of friction grew up in the community because they had a kind of God is on our side, and so we're always right attitude. And it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. They set up camp right in the middle of town on somebody's land without permission and created a lot of conflict there. And they were actually helping themselves to all sorts of things in the old scavenger way. But by 2003, that was not open for scavenging anymore. And one of the jokes was that any piece of equipment that had the Park Service owned, they knew they weren't going to steal that. And if the equipment had NPS on it, that meant not Pilgrim stuff.
That's funny. How much of this material did you know when you were reporting on it for the newspaper versus how much did you learn later? I'm assuming that the physical abuse with the children, the sexual abuse with the oldest daughter would be stuff that you learned later, or were you reporting?
I was still a reporter, and so right. It just was several years later. There was a quiet that fell over the story after my big stories that ran about the family and his background, but it was still a mystery. I remember a letter writer to the paper saying, I've never read a story with so many red flags in it. And yet it was all just red flags and cautionary notes, but there was nothing actionable. The kids were all still supporting their father and still terrified by them, it turned out. And it was 2 years later before the daughters escaped. And so I wrote about that. And then it was 3 or 4 years after that, and after his trial, and in fact, after he had died in prison, that I decided to write a book and go back and tell the story from the beginning. And then it was a matter of narrative strategy. Like, how do you tell this story in a way that makes it a page turner and that makes it a book you want to read? So I tried to write a book about how the kids escaped this situation rather than just a creepy book about this father who was such a crazy guy.
You had a negative interaction with Papa Pilgrim after your first or second story appeared on the phone.
Yeah, they would
That's
not
when
talk
he
to me
brought up
after
your
that.
wife. Yeah.
Right. They didn't want to talk to me after that. He was saying, I hear your wife's an environmentalist, so that's why you're doing this. Very Trumpy, the whole period. It was very pre-Trump, but there was a kind of the mythology that was being deployed in his service was ahead of its time in a way. But he wouldn't talk to me. That was his excuse.
And the gaslighting, I think that's it, is that whatever the kids might believe that would be negative about their father, they were immediately taught that the Bible says they can't believe that. The example that I would use is with Mr. Buckingham. He suspected the sexual abuse with the oldest daughter, and he confronted Papa Pilgrim. And what you wrote was that he told Joseph, which was the oldest son, that the Bible said not to consort with someone in the military. Meaning, let's reinterpret all of this. We know from the Bible that we can't trust this man because he's in the military.
Yeah, the Bible was continually getting twisted. I had to do a lot of Bible education to be able to tell the story. And the second half of the book is really trying to look at it from within the family and find out what was really going on, and especially tell the story of Elisheba, the oldest daughter.
And is it true that the kids remained fully clothed when they bathed? These
I don't
are
know
little.
what was true. You bathe your long johns at the same time you're bathing yourself. But he presented that as an example of how careful they were about sexual matters when the actual opposite was the case in terms of his own abuse. And so that was just more hypocrisy.
And I assume, I want to say her name wrong every time. How do you say it? Elisheba?
Elisheba.
Elisheba. Elisheba. I assume that you had long interviews with her, like how you were able to get so much detail about such terrible scenes when he almost basically beat her to death, like those terrible scenes that were just with the family. When her face was so messed up that she had to wear a ski mask.
Yeah. That was partly from interviews and partly from what the troopers determined when they took the father to court. And then Elisheba, years later, recently wrote her own memoir of her upbringing and escape. And it's an amazing book, too.
Yeah, you read it?
Oh, yeah. And I wrote a foreword for it. And I was encouraging her to do that. She's had a career working with women in abusive, patriarchal, religious settings, helping them even as she maintains her own basically fundamentalist Christian faith. So it's pretty amazing that she's not turned against the faith herself, but is seeing how her father had corrupted that faith.
Dirksen, I think is her last name now, her married name. I want to ask about that. Do you know, did all of the children remain very religious? Did any of them turn against the faith that you know of?
Not that I know of. I'm not in close touch with them now. I think their family as a whole is trying to put distance between that part of their life and their lives today. They still mostly live in Alaska and are living their Alaskan lives in business and in professions. But they've got to get over the fact that they were brought up without being able to read and write and cut off from the world the way they had been. So they've done amazing work to get beyond that, I think.
Can you talk about your relationship with McCarthy now after having written the 2 books? And I feel like Cold Mountain Path is in its way such an important document of a place that was so sparsely inhabited. If you hadn't done this, no one else would. Like this history that's just so many individual stories.
That brings me back to the Howard Weaver obituary too, is that I think I seem to be specializing in elegies these days. And it was a chance to write about a part of Alaska that was fading from view.
But it's still there.
It's still there, but it's changed. I think I described it at one point as a kind of outside magazine centerfold now with all the great
food trucks.
Yeah, all the energy for mountaineering and kayaking and tourism and good food and good beer. It's that scene now. It's very different from the sort of distant Shangri-La quality that it had back in the 60s and 70s. But
yes, but John Denver went there and made a documentary there. So it's always, I think, probably been a little bit more popular than it would have liked to have been.
Yeah. It's always been a kind of symbolic place. But I think it was just the circumstances of history that left it so isolated and physically separated from modern Alaska as the oil transition happened in the rest of the state. You had this left behind community out there. And it was a place where people who really wanted to find that old Alaska and get away. And as I said, not land in a native community. It was a unique opportunity for white settlers to do that still in the latter day. And so that created a special community. And I wanted to try to capture some of that as it was disappearing.
Well, you said your wife, Sally, had maybe almost ended up living in McCarthy. Did you ever fantasize about living in McCarthy?
No, I had part of the problem was I had my own cabin in Homer. And when you build your own cabin, you're constantly working on it. And so the idea of going out to McCarthy to have a vacation, and working on a second cabin wasn't always the most appealing. So now, and our place is not in McCarthy, it's out in the countryside. So it's more purely wilderness in the sense of being out. And it's along the road going into McCarthy right before you get to the town itself and to the footbridge. It was interesting because for many years, nobody wanted to talk about the murders in 1983, and they would feel, I think, understandably resentful if somebody sat down at the bar in the McCarthy Lodge and said, "Hey, so tell me about this murder." That was just a crass sort of response. And so I had adopted that mentality as well, even though I was a storyteller, but I had told that story up to a point in the paper, and that was enough. And then by the time I was ready to write this book, people really did want to talk about it because most people were gone who had been around then, and everybody who was living out there now really were curious to know more about this and to know more about that whole history. So I found myself elevated into the role of community storyteller, even though I was, really just a summer visitor, occasional visitor, but occasional over the course of 30 years, you become part of the community in a way. And yeah, as you say, it was, if I didn't do it, nobody else was going to do it. But
you tell the stories of some amazing people. One of them that's actually, I think, in Pilgrim's Wilderness was when you talked about the store owner in Chitna, the one who had the medical condition with his testicles and they got enormous, and everyone knew about them. There were some characters.
Yeah. And as I was saying earlier, when you're writing a local history, you want to find a story to tell and not have it just be a pile of unrelated anecdotes and characters. But on the other hand, there are certain anecdotes and characters that have to be told. And so you move in and move out quickly. I think ultimately finding the cold mountain theme of the Chinese poet and the woman who was killed in the murders, who had studied the poet Han Shan and wrote her own senior thesis at Harvard on climbing the cold mountain path, and then found that community in McCarthy, gave me a kind of a metaphor for the community. And Han Shan, writing about his poems, describe a place that seems very much like McCarthy and the Wrangell Mountains, and yet you realize in the sort of Buddhist sense, he was really writing about his self and his soul. And so that kind of gave me the way to write about the place. You write about a place that's disappearing, and ultimately you find all these attractive things to write about it or to think about it, but you can't keep it. You can't keep change from happening. Loss and change are things that confront us all. And so McCarthy, the ghost town, as a monument to impermanence, as I called it, there's that seeming contradiction, but it becomes like Frost's description of poetry as a momentary stay against confusion. As an artist, you can try to capture the thing, put it in a bottle and put it down on paper and preserve it even as it's disappearing. So that became my hope.
And you are the author, and you are the person who's written this history of more than 100 years of McCarthy. But I keep thinking about, you wrote about I think it was 1976 when they did build the bridge and they did have a road and people could drive all the way in, and people brought their RVs and it was just packed all the way through across the bridge. And that was the example of what they didn't want to have happen. And then the next winter, spring, the flood, the bridge got washed away. They decided they weren't going to do it again, and they haven't. So there's part of me that when you say it's not there anymore, I'm like, they had this potential overflow of tourists in 1976 where they allowed all the driving into McCarthy and Kennecot, and they decided they didn't want that. And they've never really opened the door for that again in the same way.
It's true. And that's a great example of that communities can decide what they want for themselves and should be able to stand up and speak up. That was the J. Hammond model of the 70s too, politically, that the state shouldn't be imposing these ideas on them from afar. We saw that in Homer with the oil drilling in Kachemak Bay in the 70s. And it seems like a different mentality now with the roads being built into far distant rural parts of Alaska.
The Ambler Road.
Ambler and the one in the Susitna, and this sort of push that it's like the last holdout of manifest destiny that will push the roads to every corner of the wilderness.
This is a little off topic, but I'll ask it anyway. When they were building the Alcan Highway, the plan was to build the road all the way to Nome. And I think everyone always says, if they built it all the way to Nome, Nome would be different. And certainly any of the villages along that highway between Fairbanks and Nome would be different. There's a part of me that wishes they built the road because we would never have it now. But if we'd done it in 1942, we could have had the road all the way to Nome. Nome would be on the road system. There'd be this access to Western Alaska that we don't have. And there would be a different experience for that part of the state.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's a trade-off between what you'd lose and what you'd gain from that. And same with the road into McCarthy. If they end up creating a bus-friendly highway into McCarthy, it's going to change quickly. There'll be big hotels and there'll be a lot of people, and it'll just not be what you won't have the experience you have if you can work your way in there on your own.
Hey, one last question now that I'm thinking about it, to compare back to our interview about the wake of the unseen object. In terms of you being flown out to middle of nowhere village, this is not that different than doing the North Country Journal. I wondered if there was any through line there at all.
McCarthy came first. It was a few years before, but I think it inspired me to travel and to see the rural parts of Alaska up close in order to write about them, for sure. I think it was a precursor. In fact, I don't think anybody knows this, but when I first sent in a proposal for The Wake of the Unseen Object through my agent and the book was bought, I was not aiming it as a book about Alaska Native culture in particular. It was really about rural Alaska. And one of the 3 chapters that I wrote in that prospectus was a McCarthy chapter about the murders. And so that was late 80s when I wrote that first take on, here's the full McCarthy story. And my editor at Henry Holt said, we really want to focus this. I think this book should be focused on the Alaska Native experience. And so I just discarded that chapter. I put it in a folder and I didn't really take it out for 25 years. And then when I was starting to work on this Cold Mountain Path and Pilgrim's Wilderness, I actually had a chapter about the murders in the first draft of Pilgrim's Wilderness as well. And I had to take that out because it was too powerful. You were reading about this great page-turning story about this family, and then you back up and get the history of the murders in McCarthy. And by the time you emerged from that chapter, blinking in the daylight saying, now what was I reading about before this? As good as it was as a piece of writing, it didn't fit in the Pilgrim book. And so pulled that out, and the whole Cold Mountain Path began with discards, you might say, from Pilgrim's Wilderness. I had a chapter of McCarthy history that I ended up taking out of Pilgrim's Wilderness as well, because, again, it was slowing down the page-turning story of will these children escape this terrible father. And so I wanted to do something with all that material, and the community wanted me to do something because they liked the pieces about themselves. And so we started it as a local project, really, to use those pieces and tell a story of McCarthy apart from the kind of prequel for the Pilgrim book. And it just grew into a whole book of itself, something I hadn't really honestly thought I was writing a pamphlet when I started. And there's just so much good material, and it was such a compelling place to write about that it turned into its own book. And we published it in Alaska.
Well, it's interesting if you take all 3 of your books, they're all about rural Alaska. have a favorite book out of your three?
I don't. No, that's my three kids. Yeah, no, I've got a good one coming too.
You do?
I don't know if it's going to be a book. Actually, I don't. It's going to be for the ADN.
Can you tell us what it's about?
Probably not.
Okay.
It's a story that links earliest Alaska to the Holocaust, and nobody knows this story. It's an amazing story. So,
Well, it's very timely.
I guess so. Yeah, it's making me, the current events are making me rethink how to tell the story.
Do you have estimated time of publication?
I don't know. I think I'm shooting for April to finish writing, but whether the paper would have space and time. But it's going to run for the Anchorage Daily News as a series.
Oh, I can't wait. So thank you so much and have a wonderful new year.
Thanks for your interest. Yeah.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. I am including a link for Tom's obituary for Howard Weaver in the show notes. If you'd like to contact me, please email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.